This is number 4 in my series of webcasts about human nature. I call this one the new normal, which is a phrase that I developed some years back to describe what I'll get into in a minute. I think that hyperparenting is actually an addiction, and I'll explain why. Addicted brains, like with alcoholics, with drug addicts, addicted brains don't really care about what's good for your kids. What addicted brains want is repetitions over and over again of those little brain boosts of chemicals that make us feel good. Welcome to the Madman Rants. I'm your host, Kevin Leonard. Why should you listen to me? Well, I've spent my entire life trying to figure out why human beings do the bizarre things we do, things that are counterproductive really to our best interests. I see my objective with these webcasts as bringing people from a position of intuitive, tribal thinking. That is, thinking that you know what's right just by looking at things and going, yeah, that seems to be the way things are. Bringing people to more fact-based, logical thinking based upon scientific facts. My colleagues, my friends, my family have told me that I'm really good at seeing threads between things that weren't previously connected and drawing those threads together and then explaining it to people in a simple way to get them to see where I'm coming from. You might agree with my opinions about human nature, the insights that I've had, or you might not, but maybe that's the point. Trying to get a new perspective and opening our brains up to new ideas and new ways of thinking. I've lived and worked in many places around the world, in Europe, in the Middle East, and in Latin America. I've traveled around the world several times and did a global tour, hitchhiking around the world for 2 years after I finished university. So I've had the chance to meet a lot of people, see a lot of different cultures, and the one thing that I've noticed is just how self-interested human beings are. Oh, sure, we can be very charitable and giving, very altruistic in the moment, but the moment we're left for as little as 17 seconds, the researchers tell us, generally our self-interest will pop back up and do what seems to be the best thing for us to do just to benefit ourselves. And when I say benefiting ourselves, I'm not talking just about us individually, but about our genetic best interests, about what is good for our children and our family, and perhaps our tribe, or the support group that we have. I spent my career working in international ad agencies, and I had my own ad agency on the beach in Mexico for 6 years. I've also done consulting on marketing strategy and a lot of public speaking. My interest in human nature and understanding it better started in high school, and it continued in university where I took motivational psychology and studied the evolution of human behavior. Throughout my life, I've been what I call a student of human nature, reading voraciously, studying all I can about psychology and the latest developments in understanding the human brain and human nature in general. I believe that people who are curious grow their brains, and that curiosity is strongly linked to a high IQ. When you're not very curious, it says a lot about your IQ. Today, I'm going to take you on a journey through human evolution. It might bore some of you, but I find it fascinating. And it's a setup for what I'm going to explain about addiction, for what I'm going to talk about with regard to hyperparenting and the devils of our worst nature, not the angels of our better nature. How is it that we human beings got to where we are? Homo sapiens sapiens, the winner of the battle for who amongst the hominids was going to win out. To illustrate the facts, I'm going to use this timeline of the evolution of human history that I believe, although I can't remember exactly, I downloaded from one of the popular science magazines several years back. This timeline goes back to approximately the time our species split off genetically from the chimpanzees. Interestingly, as far as we can tell, the chimpanzees have changed very little in the past 6 to 7 million years, but humans have evolved quite remarkably. Across the top, I've laid in a line that gradually moves upwards from the start of the chart until about 200,000 years ago when Homo sapiens came into their own. Right at the beginning, what made us different from the chimps was bipedalism, the ability to walk upright. Chimps can do it, but they can't do it for very long. This development allowed our hands to be free to hold things like our children, foodstuffs, or weapons, a development that when we descended from the trees and had to run quickly on the savanna made more sense for our species. I'm going to take you through a short list of behaviors that the hominid species started off with. These are all things that The chimpanzees share with us as well as many other species. Self-preservation, of course, most species possess, otherwise they wouldn't get too far. But in humans, self-preservation, I believe, has allowed our evolved human brain, with our consciousness, our human mind, to become very susceptible to addiction. In the race for survival that is natural selection, the successful hominid to make it through had to have a deep and abiding, almost irresistible desire to go after scarce resources to help them outcompete. I believe that that was the seed of addiction in our human brain. Of course, all species have the drive for genetic propagation. We have a drive for sex, and that is, of course, a drive that leads to us propagating and making children. The chimps and the hominids also have this drive for social cooperation, but it's much stronger in the hominids than it was in the chimps. And this led in humans to tribalism, this very strong desire to be a part of a group, a member of a group. And that leads us to hierarchy. We actually have this built into us. Jordan B. Peterson cites an author who has pointed out that lobsters have a genetic mechanism for hierarchy. If lobsters, who we share a genetic connection with many, many millions of years ago, have a predisposition for hierarchy, then it's something that is built into our genes at a very, very base level. But what this genetic predisposition for hierarchy has led to in our species is not only a willingness to murder each other, but that has led us to be able to go to war with each other and to commit genocide against the losing tribe. Our species also began with the ability to use tools, and that has given us the ability to be creative in the way that we think and the way that we solve problems. About 4.8 million years ago, social anthropologists, who are the anthropologists that specialize in figuring out what our social behavior was like during our evolution, tell us that it is likely that we developed monogamy, and that we likely developed monogamy as an adaptation to be able to help our species produce more children and to do so more safely and more securely. Remember that in genetics, it's all about propagation. It's all about the genes wanting to make more genetic copies of themselves, so adaptations that allow us to make more children are going to be advantageous and be passed on to the next generation. It wasn't until about 2.5 million years ago that we developed the ability for our ancestors to be able to figure out that they had to hit one rock with another in order to be able to fashion it into a sharper scraping tool or hand axe. About 1.8 million years ago, the hominids began to share childbearing responsibilities with each other. This freed up most members of the tribe to go out foraging and hunting without having to carry the children along with them. Knowing how Stone Age tribes live today, we know that the hominids had by this point developed what is called commonly a creche, leaving the children together in a group back at the campsite with probably the protection of a very pregnant woman or Uncle Grok, who lost a leg to a saber-toothed tiger, and teenagers to help to teach, train up, and socialize the younger children. Shortly after the development of shared child rearing came the development of how to create fire, not just to carry it, but how to create it, and how to create very sophisticated tools like flint knives and arrowheads. About 1.2 to 1.4 million years ago, it's clear that our hominid ancestors developed the abilities to communicate with each other and begin to pass knowledge from one generation to the next. It wasn't until about 500,000 years ago that our species developed the ability to create shelters. This gave them the ability to begin spreading out around the world, as they were no longer restricted to staying close to caves that they were familiar with and knew that they could turn to if they needed shelter. And it was a remarkably short time ago, 35 to 40,000 years, that human beings started to use symbolism. The very first evidence of artwork that human beings had was hand stencils, which is nothing more than spitting ochre over the top of one's hand. It wasn't until many thousands of years later that we see that in the cave paintings, human beings started to actually make representations of other things in their lives, like animals. This is what I call our 99.94% normal. For the vast majority of the hominid species time on Earth, since that split from the chimpanzees, not a heck of a lot was going on with us intellectually speaking. We started out roaming the savannah. We then moved to about 3.5 million years ago, living in caves and hunting more efficiently. It wasn't until 500,000 years ago that we began living in shelters that we created ourselves. It wasn't until about 10,000 years ago that we began living in semi-permanent villages around agricultural centers that may or may not have moved with the seasons. And now, 10,000 years later, Homo sapiens sapiens, modern human beings living in small tribes, are still living exactly the same way that our ancestors 10,000 years ago were. If we took these children, who are exactly the same as any of us in the developed world, and brought them up in Toronto, Canada, or in Paris, France, those children would grow up being normal functioning members of society, going to school, becoming tradespeople or university professors, and vice versa. If we were able to do the experiment, not that I'm recommending we do it, and take a handful of children from any developed world country and drop them onto a deserted island and be sure that they survive, they would not develop the ability to speak a language for many generations. And the reason that a newly isolated tribe of modern human beings would not have a language, it has nothing to do with their IQ, it has nothing to do with their creativity, it has to do with their storage of human knowledge. When the elders of any tribe get killed off, by pestilence, by predators, by the ice age, whatever it might be, the young people of the tribe lose their storage of human knowledge. And if they have no elders whatsoever, they have no knowledge to fall back on. They must start to create their knowledge base from scratch. And we are wired for teleology. What that means is that children are wired to start seeing meaning in the ultimate purpose of things in front of them. They see rough bark on trees being there for bears to sharpen their claws on. They see the reason for birds existing as sources of music to make us happy when we wake up in the morning. That teleological thinking can also be seen as intuitive thinking. Now that we understand that religion actually has a basis in our brains, that it is hardwired from day one, teleological thinking, which is essentially intuitive thinking, looking at things and thinking that because we see a reason for it, that is the reason that things exist, is the basis of all religion. And researchers are now beginning to see that religious belief lights up the addiction center of our brains. I would imagine you could figure out what is wrong with this illustration of what our caveman ancestors looked like at a time when human beings just began to develop the ability to care for one another as a group. What's wrong with this picture is that light skin only developed about 7,000 years ago in Northern Europe. Until that point, we were definitely dark-skinned, as the Human Genome Project has illustrated for us. Let's talk now not about the evolution of humankind, but the timeline of our human knowledge. Down on the right side, there's this tiny little slice that represents the last 200,000 years or so. And if we shrink down this 5.9 million years into a space on the left and only look here at the period from around the Paleolithic era of 100,000 years ago, and now we're actually stretching that out to 200,000 years as we get to know more about the background of our species and anthropologists uncover more and more artifacts. The timeline of human knowledge is a line that looks like a hockey stick, stretching up from very little development over 6 million years on the far left to not too much development over the ensuing 100 to 200,000 years, and only seeing this hockey stick-like upward growth, perhaps to infinity. We're unsure of what our human minds are capable of now that we've got the ability to write down our thoughts, record them, and share them with each other. But if we look now at significant developments over the last 200,000 years, we have evidence at 140,000 years ago of our human ancestors beginning to use jewelry to decorate themselves. It's actually not until about 120,000 years ago that we started to use pigmentation to actually color things like seashell jewelry. At 72,000 years ago, we see evidence of clothing first being developed, which of course became important as our species started to spread northward into colder climates. At 50,000 years ago, we see the beginning of cultural revolution, of ritual burials and more complex hunting techniques. At 35,000 years ago, we see the first evidence of physical symbolization. At 10,000 years ago, we began to start farming and started to have semi-permanent villages like this one. 7,000 to 8,000 years ago, both lighter skin and the ability to eat dairy products and digest them properly were adaptations that allowed humans living in northern climates to absorb more vitamin D, which was essential at latitudes where there was a lot of cloud cover during winter and the sun was very low in the sky. It wasn't until 5,500 years ago that we began writing down conceptual ideas and being able to pass those ideas from one generation to the next. It was only at that point that we see the hockey stick of human knowledge begin to rocket upwards. Given the course of human evolution, it was only the blink of an eye ago that we see Socrates and Plato and all the more modern geniuses that have given rise to so many human inventions and the development of our human knowledge base. It was the development of our bigger human brains that allowed us to dominate the entire globe. We are now the sixth wave of global extinction. Not a bad accomplishment for a species that just as recently as 6 million years ago came down from the trees and began walking on two legs. Which brings me back to what I call the new normal. Human beings are so quick to adapt to anything new and say, well, it's perfectly normal for us because everyone else is doing it. What you see on the left is a photograph taken from a helicopter of an uncontacted tribe in the Amazon jungle. These folks, who are genetically identical to ourselves, are living the way that we human beings would most naturally live if we did not have an accumulation of human knowledge. So what we're seeing there is what is most naturally our normal. Yet what we see here is the way that we human beings are living today. Given our druthers, everyone wants their own house with their own walled-in little garden. The contrast here is between what is actually our normal, bringing up children in a creche in a group with the oldest kids bringing up the youngest kids, and everyone eating together around a communal campfire, and the way that we have allowed ourselves to go. What's normal is what's on the left. What's on the right is not quite normal, and it is affecting, I believe, the way that our brains work. Versus our cousins in the jungles of Brazil, this is what we consider to be our new normal. People walled off from neighbors, nuclear families, with inexperienced moms and dads, absolutely convinced that whatever pops into their brains in terms of how they should raise their kids is the new normal. They take no advice from their experienced older brothers and sisters, aunts and uncles, or moms and dads. They don't need any advice because this being the new normal, they are the only ones who should have any influence on their genetic copies, their kids. This is our new normal, not isolated tribes in various jungles around the world, but a worldwide group of humans completely interconnected with each other via the internet. I'm not saying it's a bad thing. I'm just saying we don't really understand how this is affecting our species because it is really not the most natural way for us to interact. And this is the new normal. Highly addictive software that is specifically designed to entice people to spend more time on any particular app's screen, being handed to infants and addicting them from a very early age. This is completely abnormal for our species. We are a social species with children that are supposed to grow up interacting with other kids of all different ages of one's tribe, playing outside, learning as we go, being very frightened of the saber-toothed tigers, sometimes having disappointment, losing our parents at an early age. What scientists know now is that the human brain, from a very young age, starts off with all white matter in the brain. Yes, I'm oversimplifying. And that it begins to prune from toddlerhood through until about the age of 30. It finishes a bit earlier in women than it does in men. This pruning process strengthens the connections and the pathways in the brain that we are using regularly. It allows the pathways that we are not using to die off. In other words, if kids are living in a stressful environment, they're going to lay down and strengthen certain pathways for survival in their brain that they won't lay down if they're living in an environment where there's absolutely no threats, no challenges, no boredom, and no disappointments. I believe that what we are doing by encouraging addiction, by handing kids tablets at a very early age, specifically designed to addict them at various stages of their development, early on to little rewards, later on to fighting it out in video games that teenagers play, is rewiring their brain. And we are already seeing in the latest group of social justice warriors on campus an entire generation of kids who started with Game Boys and Pac-Man and what have you, and are now in a position in university where they are freaking out because they have to deal with an environment that is full of disappointment and contradictions, and the need to have to use logic and reason and rationale to argue your points clearly instead of just assuming that mommy and daddy are going to be 100% supportive of you. They came through a school and high school system where the teachers had become paranoid about ever criticizing or ever even trying to force them to learn certain things, or ever having to teach them to be open-minded and learn new ways of thinking about the world around them. I believe that we're going to see a devastating future for humankind because this new generation is not going to be as adaptable as the generation that came before it. So let's talk a little bit about addiction and the human brain, the human mind as it's evolved. Are these things bad habits or are they something else? An incredible amount has been learned about addiction and the human brain over the past several years. Addiction is very simple. It is merely the repetition of anything that at a relatively low cost sets off the reward center of the brain with little bursts of dopamine and other chemicals. Any behavior that we participate in that sets off those little bursts of dopamine can be addictive. Research with new imaging techniques has proven beyond a shadow of a doubt that it is the addiction center of the brain that lights up when we participate in all kinds of behaviors that we used to think were innocuous. Anything that is so compulsive that we participate in it to the point that it disrupts our lives or our careers or our families is addiction. Religious belief being the one that scares me most. Here are some things to think about. We know that heroin and other drugs can be highly addictive and lead to disruption in the brain's wiring. Alcohol can be highly addictive and devastates the lives, careers, and the family life of millions of alcoholics. We know that smoking is terribly addictive and adversely affects the health of all the people who fall prey to it. Gambling is addictive and can ruin lives. Shopping is addictive and ruins lives through credit card debt. Social apps are addicting people. You need look no further than a group of 20-somethings in a bar or a restaurant today. Prescription drugs are highly addictive. They are ruining America right now with all those little old ladies who used to criticize drug addicts and say, oh, they're so weak, they have such low willpower. Now so many of those little old ladies are addicted to opioids. Sex can be addictive. Food can be addictive. Look at all the people in the world that are either suffering from diabetes or have what they call pre-diabetes. They're overweight or grossly overweight. This will be a tremendous strain upon the healthcare system, and we'll see many people dying far younger than they need to. Sun tanning is highly addictive. Those little bursts of vitamin D that you get from sitting under one of those machines or sitting out in the sun. Nail biting, well, okay, I'll give you that one. It's just a bad habit. But hoarding is not. People who hoard constantly have a reward loop in their brain that tells them that every time they keep something, every time they hold on to that stack of old newspapers, they're doing the right thing. And they look forward to that little burst of pleasure in their brain that reassures them that hoarding and filling their house up with garbage is a really good idea. It's addictive behavior. Self-mutilation is my name for tattooing. And you cannot tell me in this day and age, with all of these people that you see with tattoos growing up the sides of their necks, across their heads, onto their faces, and covering their arms and limbs, is not addictive. Yes, it's painful, but these people spend all of their time obsessing over, looking in the mirror, and trying to figure out where else they can get more tattoos and what those tattoos should look like. These people are addicted and they're disaffecting their future in life because most people look at this self-mutilation in horror and find it highly uncomfortable to be around. Is the reaction of these people unfair or closed-minded? No. Our human brains are wired to judge the health of others by their appearance. And unmutilated skin signifies health, while mutilated skin sets off a negative reaction in our brains. For teenage girls, texting is absolutely addictive. They are at a stage in their life where they are desperate to make connections with other teenage girls. Why? Because when we were evolving, most of us would lose our parents by the time they were in their 30s. So when we became teenagers, it was essential for us to develop lifelong friendships with peers in order to have tribal members who we could rely on to look after us and our children. Video gaming in young men is highly addictive because it taps into their need to learn how to shoot a bow and arrow, how to throw a spear, how to wrestle with other males in order to protect oneself when inevitably tribes would go to war with each other and males were the ones who were participating in the battles. Online porn is highly addictive, and it turns out that it is not so much actually looking at the images. What psychologists and psychiatrists are learning now is that it is the anticipation of pleasure that we are addicted to, not the pleasure itself. So in all of these addictions, it is not so much doing the actual thing. It's the irresistible draw to do it again that we look forward to and we think about and obsess over that draws us back in. What about abusing? Men who abuse are addicts, I believe. They really enjoy the high of abusing and looking forward to the next opportunity to get drunk and abuse women. It's sad, but it's true. On the other end of the scale, hunting and fishing don't seem to me to be just hobbies. When you talk to guys who are really into it, they spend a lot of their time and a lot of their money obsessing over when they're going to go hunting or fishing next. And those activities tie back into what we as evolved beings needed back in the day. We needed to be excited about going out there and trying to find more protein for the tribe. How about depression? I'm not sure. It may not fall into the realm of what stimulates the reward center of the brain. And yet there's something in that, of that constant repetition and of being unable to pull out of it, that seems a lot like an addiction. I'd suggest it needs some study. Social justice is something I've done a video on before. The lure of virtue signaling and trying to beat out everybody else on how much you're a victim and how much you're going to be better at helping all the people of the world than somebody else is. If you are someone who's hardwired for being leftist, liberal, and not hardwired for being rightist, conservative, the idea of helping people and being a victim yourself is a tremendously seductive one that I suspect has a lot of elements of addiction in it. This is something that no one is talking about, and yet I see it in the people that I've met, myself included, who have OCD, ADHD, and I think those two things almost always go together. And that is that these people who have OCD are constantly listening to their own brains. When their brains say, why don't you do this next? People with OCD very quickly drop whatever they're doing to go and follow their brain's whim. And what happens inside of the brain when you do those things, when you answer the brain's demands to do something, is that the brain provides you with a dopamine reward that makes you go, whoa, that's good. I'm glad I did what my brain wanted to do. So there's something strangely addictive in the behavior of OCDs. They cannot stop their behavior, and they continually go back to it again. There's clearly something very enjoyable about it. Otherwise, they would break the habit, because it can really ruin people's lives. Speaking of OCD, how many kids do you know have enough drive and motivation and obsession to wake up at 3 and 4 o'clock in the morning, sneak out of their house, buy cans of paint, and go painting walls for hours and hours during the nighttime? There's something strangely obsessive and highly addictive about that behavior. They feel so good after they've painted a wall and have painted over the rival group's graffiti or have outsmarted the cops and have created this work of art that I believe is highly addictive. Last but not least, I think that there's this other thing, this other human behavior that is addictive, and that the people who are suffering from this addiction have this little thing go off in their brain where they say, oh, I'm going to do this, and it's going to make me feel so good to be in charge, to make these decisions, to change a little person's life. And that's parenting. We've gotten to this point where hyper-parenting is actually, I believe, an addiction, an addictive behavior, where people are locked into it and can't break out of it, and they are not doing the right thing for their kids. They're doing exactly the wrong thing for their children. So our new normal is hyper-parenting. It's okay because everybody's doing it, right? I was amazed when I first moved back to Canada after years of being abroad to find in my parents' old neighborhood, every other driveway had one of those freestanding basketball nets. And yet I never saw anybody playing basketball. Kids were never allowed out on the street by themselves. I witnessed moms leaving the kids in the house, pulling the minivan out of the garage and rolling it up to the front of the house, and then opening the sliding door of the minivan, getting all the chairs ready, walking up to the front door, opening the door and saying, okay, kids, looking up and down to make sure no pedophiles were going to drop in by parachute, and ferrying the kids one by one directly into the van, strapping them in, closing the door, looking out for pedophiles, and then driving the van to the local kiddie playground where they could be sure that there were no pedophiles about to steal their children. And there is less risk of pedophilia and child abduction today than there was years ago when I was roaming the streets with my little buddy on our bicycles. Evolution has quite accidentally given us overly smart brains. There's no other species that has developed this level of intelligence, and all of them are still around after millions and millions of years, like the chimpanzees and the dolphins. No species, ours included, really needed to be as intelligent as we are, and yet we're stuck with it, so now we've got to deal with it. So what our accidentally smart brains gave rise to was the mind, the uniquely human mind, and that has given us ego. Our egos make us think we're super smart, we're always right, etc. Evolution also gave us strong self-interest, and our drive for self-interest has seen us create nuclear families and these walled properties that we live within, where we don't talk to the neighbors anymore, we don't interact with them, we certainly don't have our families over living with us, and we don't have grandma, grandpa, aunts, and uncles helping to raise our children. Our drive to propagate overcomes eventually our interest in being higher up the hierarchy, that is, our drive to get a better career and gain more money and more status by working in that career. By the time couples get to their mid-30s, especially the women tend to drop out of the workforce, have kids, and stay at home. Suddenly, getting more money and having more status isn't as appealing as it was in one's 20s. And I believe that that drive that gets cultivated in the workplace does not go away when we become parents in our 30s. I believe it's the case that people who become parents in their late teens and early 20s don't hyper-parent quite the way that people in their 30s do. And the ego that comes with our big human mind, it reassures those inexperienced overachievers that they just don't need the help of their parents or the rest of their tribe. So sadly, we are facing the new normal. We have kids who can't function normally in the world. And I believe the problem we're seeing with universities today, with this generation of students who cannot bear to hear any ideas that run contrary to what they've heard their whole lives, who need psychiatrists on hand in university to help them get through the stress of going through exams and perhaps failing in life. I believe that this is a function of this first generation who were addicted in youth. Their brains have been rewired, and the consequence is showing up in their behavior on campus. These are kids who actually are wired differently than previous generations of humans. And that's a scary, scary thing that no one has really been looking into. So these kids can't function normally, and yet at the age of 16, the way our scholastic system in the Western world is set up is that they have to decide at 16, not even 17 or 18, what they're going to do for the rest of their life. They've got to make a choice about what university they're going to apply to. This is a scary thing for them. I don't even know now what I want to do with the rest of my life, let alone make a choice at 16 of what kind of a career I'm going to go into by choosing the right kind of university. The baby boomers and the generation that followed them were kind of the me generation. It was all about them, making more money, buying more toys, having a better time in life. Everything was getting better and better for them. That generation of parents has told this new generation of children, oh, you can be anything you want, sweetie pie, you're special. And the kids actually believe it because they've never heard anything different. Every single conversation that they've ever had with their parents has ended with, I love you, oh no, I love you more. Even that's a problem, because constantly telling someone that you love them is actually a function of being worried that you might die in the next hour before you see them again. This is a race to be sure that you never left the side of anyone that you care about without saying, I love you. Think about what that sets up. It sets up the idea that, hey, you might never see me again. We might die. What a horrible negative way to go through life. I'm going to read this content because I don't think you can read it on your screen. An old Cherokee is teaching his grandson about life. A fight is going on inside of me, he said to the boy. It's a terrible fight, and it is between two wolves. One is evil. He is anger, envy, sorrow, regret, greed, arrogance, self-pity, guilt, inferiority, lies, false pride, superiority, and ego. He continued, the other is good. He is joy, peace, love, hope, serenity, humility, kindness, benevolence, empathy, generosity, truth, compassion, and faith. The same fight is going on inside you and inside every other person too. The grandson thought about it for a minute and then asked his grandfather, which wolf will win? The old Cherokee simply replied, the one you feed. What we do when we constantly feed ourselves negativity and anything that is addictive, related to addictive behavior, is bad for us. It's negative, and it's something we should try to get away from and get out of in any way we possibly can. And if there are people out there who are constantly preventing their children from having any bad influence, from being exposed to peanuts or germs at an early age, or being prevented from any bad feelings, from being bored. And boredom is essential to human development in kids. It teaches them creativity. It teaches them how to go out and socialize. If they are prevented from disappointment, and disappointment is tremendously important to our development as social beings, what I believe these parents are doing is feeding their own egos. They say that they're doing stuff for the good of their kids, and yet they're not. They're not looking at reality, and they're not listening to anyone else. Parenting today is treated like some kind of a religious thing, where nothing is allowed to be said to these people, even though clearly they're making mistakes, and older, more experienced people, or even non-parents like me who've spent a lot of time thinking about it and researching about it, know more than these inexperienced parents do, and yet they don't listen to them. Oh, they'll go out and buy every new book out there or look at YouTube videos on parenting, and yet they're not picking up on what is most essential, which is the fact that they're making huge mistakes by following their ego. We're seeing in university students, they really do believe they can be anything, even though they're really badly suited for it because they had to make a decision at age 16 as to what they were going to do with college or university. What we're seeing is hyper-parents who've spent millions, billions of collective dollars. These are parents living vicariously through their kids. I've seen kids who are no good at baseball or no good at football being forced to go into it for years on end because daddy always wanted to be a baseball star and hopes that his kid might be an NHL hockey star. Oh yes, many parents are just doing what they think the kid likes most. And yet, if the kid is not going to become an Olympic quality athlete, I'm not sure if it makes sense to continue to spend hordes and hordes of money on them, sending them down that path. Especially if your primary goal in life is to protect your kids from ever feeling the pain of disappointment, which, by the way, I think is a hugely egotistical thing. It's not something you're doing for the good of your child. It's something you're doing for the good of your own ego. To be able to say, I always protected my child from any kind of disappointment because I was such a great parent. When I was about 13, 14, I wanted to be a rock star and get all the fame, fortune, and the girls. So I asked my mom and dad to buy me a guitar. And my mom did for my birthday, but she said, you can't have the guitar unless you're going to take lessons and really work hard at learning how to play this thing. Of course, I agreed and went off to guitar lessons. And after about 6 months of lessons, my instructor took my mom aside and said, Kevin, you just wait outside for a minute. I need to talk to your mom. After about 5 minutes, she came out and took me by the hand and picked up my guitar and said, come on, son, let's go. And I was like, well, where are we going, Mom? I'm here for the lesson. She said, no, I'll explain in a minute. We're going to get in the car. Started driving, and my mom said, come on, we're driving to the art supply store. I said, why, Mom? She said, because you're going to try your hand at becoming an artist. Isn't that going to be fun? So I learned at that early teenage stage that there's no point in banging your head against something if a professional tells you that you're just not suited for it. Well, I've always thought, listening to the kids of my friends, my nephews and nieces, trying to make decisions about what they're going to do with their life at the age of 16, I thought, wouldn't it be great if there was a better parenting tool? So I've invented a new concept. I haven't had the wherewithal to get this up and going. Wouldn't it be great if online there was a battery of tests, these tests already exist, that parents could go through with their kids for IQ, their type of personality, their predisposition for things, their proclivities, their passions for things, etc. The first test would be free to try, but then there'd be fees on an ongoing basis. The tests on the website would keep track of the kids from the time they're toddlers through to their late teens. Algorithms would provide recommendations on the ideal career choices for any individual, and reports would come out on a going basis tracking their development and indicating, despite their passionate interest in something that they're no good at, what might be the best direction for them to go in, with the child's network of guidance counselors, parents, and friends, gently guiding them down a path that would lead to true happiness down the road, instead of disappointment having chosen something that you're just not good at. So by listening to all of this, you've agreed to a non-disclosure with me, that you won't steal the idea and run with it. And instead, if you know of any investors who might be interested in supporting me and getting this idea off the ground, send them my way. You can find my contact information on my blogs or LinkedIn. If you want to break an addiction, there are 5 stages you've got to go through. Number 1 is recognizing that you have a permanent, lifelong issue that negatively affects your family, your work, or yourself. And what I mean by that is waking up to the fact that this thing is never going away. If you don't do something about it, it's going to continue to adversely affect your life and the lives of the people around you. After you've admitted that you've got a problem, the only way to break the addiction is to admit it to everyone else. And you see this in alcoholics who have successfully conquered their problem. They will constantly say, no thanks, I don't drink anymore. And whether they're proud of it or whether they're simply admitting it, it helps them to conquer the urge to go back to drinking again, to constantly say to everyone around them, no, I'm an alcoholic, I can't drink. Number 3, you have to seek help. Because we're egotistical, and especially some males, but there's females too, who are so egotistical, especially narcissistic psychopaths. They don't believe they've got any problems. A lot of people think, oh, I can just talk to myself. I'll talk myself through this. I'll get through this problem on my own. It's complete and utter bullshit. We are social beings, and we need the help of others in order to get through these kinds of big problems in our lives. Despite all those self-help books out there, no one really can help themselves out of an addiction. The only way through it is to sit down and talk to someone else. It doesn't really matter what kind of therapy you go through or who you talk to. It's simply been proven by decades of study that talking to another human being is what helps human beings to break these cycles. Number 4, accept and assimilate the help that you've been given, truly and deeply. If you don't take it on board and really go, I've been listening and I hear what you're saying and I see how I've got to change. If you don't assimilate that advice and really take it on board, you're never going to get over being addicted and come out the other side and fight that addiction and not go back to it. Because so many things are triggers. Anything that makes you think about the addictive behavior again is a trigger that sucks you back in again. And number 5, never again give in to your brain's strong desire to relapse. Or if you do relapse, you've gradually got to get better at conquering number 1. My nephew is a pothead. He has been addicted to the high that you get from THC. It's not the leaves of the marijuana that are particularly addictive, or the smoking of it. It's the high that you get from the THC. And people get used to being high and like to go back to it and cannot stop going back over and over again. There comes a point at which they feel more normal, quote unquote, inside of that high of THC than out of it. That's what makes marijuana so addictive. The high from THC is insidious, and it starts to infiltrate people's lives. Potheads can't get used to the idea of treating it like alcohol and coming home in the evening and having 1 or 2 drinks to settle down. They start feeling like they have to be high all day long. They start with taking THC in the morning, they have another hit at lunchtime, they do it again in the afternoon, and take a bunch more all evening long, including just before bed because they feel like they can't sleep without it. And then the next day they start all over again. And it's a debilitating addiction. It ruins the way that you learn, it ruins the way that you interact with people, and it ruins the way that you perform at the job or in social situations, etc. The only way that my nephew found to keep himself from what he called falling back down the pothole was to change his lifestyle and get away from anything that put him in a position where he remembered what it was like to be high in the situations where he used to get high, etc. So only by going through these 5 stages is anyone going to be able to break any of those multiple addictions that we human beings fall into so easily, dopamine being one of the strongest. But there is another addictive substance that we have coursing through our brains all the time, and that's something called oxytocin. Not OxyContin, the opioid, but oxytocin, a natural hormone that is called the bonding hormone. I could not understand, as a non-parent, why it is the case that so many parents, both moms and dads, will talk non-stop about a visit that's coming up with their kids. Either they get together every Sunday, or they're Christmas or Easter, or the kids are coming from a visit from living overseas, or whatever it might be. And one of the insidious parts of addiction is that we aren't addicted to the actual high that we get. It turns out that what we're addicted to is the anticipation of the high. And so in looking at parents talking about getting together with their kids, or moms talking about cooking a meal for their children, which is another thing that seems to set off a burst of oxytocin in moms' brains. And I don't mean to seem frivolous, but I noticed after watching a lot of those intervention shows back in the day that listening to parents talking about getting together with their kids is like listening to a drug addict talking about wanting to get high again. And what I believe it is that it's unconscious, but in being close to our own children, the pheromones that we detect in the air when we're around them set off a burst of oxytocin that is addictive and makes us want to be close to our children. It's a natural human thing, but it's one of those insidious addictive things that not only helped our species to survive and helps to make sure that families stick together, but I think it's one of those things that proves just how strong addiction is in the human brain. Oxytocin is what they call the bonding chemical, the bonding hormone. And women get a strong release of oxytocin every time they breastfeed. And they also get a strong release of it every time they have sex with a man, whether or not they have an orgasm. So it is oxytocin, that creates that bond between moms and their children, and between women and the men that they fall in love with. There are women out there, and in being single for many years, I believe this to be true, that they're in love with the idea of being in love. They're addicted to it. When they don't feel that high that they get in the initial stages of love, they actually will decide to divorce their partners. They go off in search of that high again, that oxytocin high that you get from falling into romantic love with someone in the early stages. It cannot last. It doesn't last. And yet that's what they're in search of. It's a scary thing. If this webcast has inspired some new thoughts in your mind, opened up some new horizons, and given you a new perspective, I hope you'll consider going into the description box below this YouTube video and clicking on the link to make a donation, to go to patreon.com and become a supporter, or to go to one of my blogs and click on the link to make a donation. Thanks for liking, sharing, and I hope you'll become a subscriber to my channel.